you've been part of a push, I suppose, or there's a call for tax reform. You say we're too reliant on income tax, which isn't a view that is isolated out there. What's the view on the solution then? What does it come down to? Does that inevitably mean we revisit GST?
Look, I think what it means is I'm very supportive of what independent Allegra Spender is doing, and she's having the conversation that neither of the big parties are having, and that is to bring all sides around the table, the economic experts, the business leaders, the social sector as well, trying to get everyone together to find out what can we do, because we've heard from the intergenerational report that it's not a great outlook, that we are overburdening individuals and young people, and we know going forward we're going to leave young people and future generations worse off than what we currently are. And I think that's something that does have to be addressed, and it's an issue of fairness. So it's having the conversation.
So if we're already too reliant on income tax, should the stage 3 income tax cuts, the only ones that are sitting there legislated, be left alone?
Personally, I think that we are too heavily reliant on income tax, and I think if we look at what's going to happen in the intergenerational report, that proportion of our tax base will increase to 60% or so over the next sort of number of decades. So we do have to look at whether that is actually sustainable into the future. We know that there's a shrinking, as our population ages, there's a shrinking number of workers to rely on. They will have increased burden of things like HECS, housing and insurance, plus all the growing debt on things like defence, on how we're going to be rebuilding from climate disasters and adaptation, and our ageing population and aged care and health.
So conversations matter, but so does sort of going, here's a suggestion and willing to campaign for it even if it's unpopular. Is GST one of those things that would fit the bill?
I think everything's on the table. When you look at how you gather tax, you look at spending, you look at assets and you look at income. Everything needs to be on the table at this point because we know what we've got ahead of us, and what is currently happening is failing. So
because you were, I think before the election you were against touching the GST. Now you're saying you're open to it. You're not saying
I didn't have a position on GST before the election.
Okay, but so you're willing to have that conversation. When you talk as well around all the different elements of it, so it's not just here's the set taxes we have. What about other ideas such as capital gains tax on the family home, given how expensive our family homes are getting? Is that something that should be on the table?
One thing that needs to be looked at is the housing crisis. We know we've got a housing crisis. There are more and more people are having to rely upon affordable housing. So, as I said, Allegra Spender is bringing everyone around the table, both business leaders and the social sector. So it's an agreement between people what we can do going forward for this country, because we don't want to be burdening young people and families entirely with the tax burden for this country. We do have to look at a way that is fair, and so that people who are working hard, do have an opportunity to own their own house. I think that's only fair.
Right, but what about the CGT on the family home? Because
yeah, like everything needs to be on the table, absolutely everything. And I'm not saying one thing over another. I think the experts need to have that discussion. And sadly, to this point, I think both the major parties have been too afraid to have that conversation. But we need to move past this short-term political cycle. We actually need to do what's in the best interest of Australia and have a long-term vision. And that conversation, it is a hard conversation, but that conversation does need to be had. And I think it's unfortunate it's being left up to the crossbench to drive the conversation.
The other element is sort of more of a user pays system, whether it's, the obvious ones, road charges, even a family home being means tested for aged care, for example. Is that the other side of it? Because then you don't have to worry as much about the tax base. Would a family home being means tested for aged care be something that would be?
I'm sure that would become part of the conversation. But if you're looking at specific taxes, I think something like stamp duty is known to be a very inefficient tax. And actually, if stamp duty was removed and we moved towards land tax instead, then that would be able to increase home ownership by 7%. And that's something that the federal government can step into, because yes, it is a state tax, but it does need to have support from the federal government as well. And then also around, I think another thing is the petroleum resource rent tax. Currently, if you look at comparable countries to what Australia is doing with our offshore oil and gas, there's other countries that are, their revenue that they are receiving from their offshore oil and gas is 20 times what we are receiving. And I think Australians have been dudded.
Okay. All right, the government has a plan there. Obviously, you're pushing for more.
But the plan, I would say I am pushing for more, because the government's changes are quite modest.
What about the WA deal on the GST? Is that a bit of a handbrake on national coffers? Should that be looked at as well?
Look, I think that's up to the experts to look at. I'm not going to be commenting on the WA GST.
Well, you could put everything off to experts. This is this special deal to give them more than the previous carve-up happened.
Well, I think that everything needs to be a part of the conversation, so that needs to be looked at as well. I'm not an expert on that.
Okay. And when you talk about the holistic approach, because I know the Teals, I know there's sort of different words, but the Teal MPs, independent MPs, community MPs,
independent
have been big on tax transparency. Allegra Spender's family trust got $280 million. It's offshore money, and so the ATO transparency report says it's offshore money, effectively tax not paid in Australia. Is that an area for reform?
I don't know anything about Allegra's personal tax, and I don't think I can comment on that. But I think transparency is a really important thing that we all need to be talking about. Maybe you ask that question to Allegra.
I'll certainly put it to her. But don't you sort of read the tax transparency reports, or does this get your attention?
I haven't. Well, I'm sure it does get the attention, but I think that's kind of a gotcha question, which I'm not aware of.
What do you mean by gotcha question?
Well, exactly that.
Yeah, but I'm just asking about tax transparency, and I'm sure you MPs take note of each other's sort of media and approach to things.
Yes.
Yeah.
What can I say on that?
So you haven't read anything to do with that story?
I have not read anything to do with that story on Allegra's Spender's tax. No, I haven't.
Okay, no worries. Sophie Scamps, thanks for your time.
Thank you.